Hello, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about this 2024 documentary, as far as I can tell, called Sacrificing Liberty. And all I can say is, wow. If you have been following on my Palestine Bookshelf channel, I have covered two books. And after this stream, actually, I'll be covering the second of two documentaries on what happened in 1967 with the Liberty. This documentary is in four parts. It adds up to more than 4 hours. And I think not only is it the best documentary I've seen on it, it's also something that puts together what I've had to piece together in two different books. So I did a review on James Scott's book on the Liberty, which was the what book. Like, here's the event. And then I did a review on Joan Millen's Blood in the Water, which was the why book. This documentary puts together the what's and the whys. And it does so with an unprecedented amount of video footage, of photography, and testimony of survivors. So if someone is interested, but they're not going to take the time to read 700 pages of books, which I've reviewed, fine. They're not even going to watch these other documentaries. If they're only going to watch one documentary, I would say it would be this one. So Sacrificing Liberty, it's in four parts. And I would encourage you, I think there is one upload on YouTube or somewhere where it has all of it together. And I would encourage you to break it up, not only because 4 hours is a long time to commit to watching something, but it'll allow you to absorb things over time. Antonio, good afternoon. Good afternoon to yourself. So there's really many ways we could go about this live stream today. I think I want to stay open to questions you might have, either if you've seen the documentary or you have questions about why you should see the documentary. Although I think that's rather obvious. You want to know what happened with the USS Liberty and why there's been such a cover up. I think I'll talk about a few things that this documentary surfaces that I think are important. I will start with the Rafi Eitan request to stop the interview. Now, interestingly enough, the footage from this, in which Eitan is asked about Operation Cyanide, and he says, "I think we should stop the interview." That is actually taken from a 2002 BBC documentary, which I am reviewing after this on the Palestine Bookshelf channel, called Dead in the Water. Now, interestingly, the British, as they often can do, and sometimes the BBC actually does in some of their documentaries, they're asking these difficult questions. And he keeps pushing Eitan. It's been 34 years. Why can't you say anything? And Eitan says, "Well, I have a loyalty to my country," etc. So Eitan is not allowed to comment on Operation Cyanide. For those of you who don't know what Operation Cyanide was, it was something coordinated between James Angleton and Mate Amir, who is his Israeli counterpart. James Angleton was head of counterintelligence for the CIA at the time and built a lot of his reputation on intelligence, true or false, that he received from Assad and his other contacts there. But their idea was false flag operation in the Med near Egypt, blame Egypt, get the US involved on Israel's side. Now, you have to see this in context of two other events. One, closer in time, the Gulf of Tonkin event, in which McNamara and Johnson, LBJ, fabricated an attack on a US ship in order to get America more involved in Vietnam. So there was a false flag used to initiate military action. And prior to this, Operation Northwoods, which was submitted to President Kennedy by then head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Lyman Lemnitzer, in which they wanted to initiate a war with Cuba by blowing up a ship, by attacking their own troops, or at least making it seem that way, in order to inflame public opinion against Cuba and to spur an invasion. So if you understand that those, both Operation Northwoods, which is declassified, you can go find it on the internet. It's not some very difficult document to find. So that's in the beginning of the 60s. And then you have Gulf of Tonkin, which is happening, not far from this event. Then you understand, okay, having a false flag attack so that America can get involved in Israel's side during this war is not so far-fetched. Now, these sorts of things can be planned by smaller groups of individuals. So Angleton's group and Amir's group's not a very large group, but it's enough to pass the word such that the Israelis were given free rein. They knew that the ship was an American ship. We have their own records. We have their own recordings, which are played throughout this documentary and other documentaries, that they knew it was an American ship and they went after it anyway. And it seems at least one of their pilots was court-martialed for refusing. One of these brave Israelis who refused to bomb an American ship. And we never heard of him. So Rafi Eitan's refusal, he says, I want to stop the interview. He does that in the 2002 BBC documentary, which, as I said, they take the stock footage from that and put it into this documentary, I think is very telling. You also have this criminal, Robert McNamara, saying, what was the phrase he says? I'm not saying anything. And he says, I haven't looked into it very much. Let me get this straight. You have dozens of U.S. sailors murdered. You have many more of them injured. And you haven't looked into it that much. And that you're not saying anything. And this, again, this goes back to a general worldview, which may be difficult for those who are atheists or secularists, because for them, injustice is a very hard pill to swallow. But for those of us who believe in something that stands outside of time, and we know that in that burning desire for justice that was put inside us as humans is something supernatural. It is not something purely natural. There's a reason why a 4 or 5-year-old child says, "Mommy, that's not fair." Who taught that kid that? It's something inside of us. And so we have this burning desire for justice. And it wasn't implanted in there by accident. And it means because issues of adjudication of justice are not just confined to this world. They will be dealt with in the next world. And so if McNamara thinks that he's going to dodge the justice of what he did by saying refusing to answer questions on a television interview, he's already found out, because he's died and he's gone to his particular judgment. And so he's found out that wasn't exactly the way to deal with the murder of US sailors, is by lying on a television interview. But the evidence is there. We have a number of other people, Dean Rusk, who told NATO ambassadors in Luxembourg that summer that he believed that Israel knew and attacked. You have in this documentary something I learned for the first time. So I would say, so parts 1 through 3 of the documentary really take you through how was the Liberty, what kind of boat was the Liberty? Here are some of the stories of the men who joined, then the action of the day, and then the aftermath. The fourth part of the documentary is really trying to give you more context. So now that we've given you everything that happened on that day, well, what's the other context that you might need? Something fascinating to me that I had not read about in either of the 2 books that I'd read or either of the 2 documentaries I'd seen was the story of Madeleine Krim. Now, Madeleine Krim was a blonde wife. This was her second marriage to someone who was quite close to LBJ. And she was staying in the White House during the days of these attacks. In her previous life, when she was a first wife, she was one to someone highly involved in Israeli intelligence. So this person, obviously, also, it was intimated in the documentary, and not that difficult to believe given LBJ's character, that was maybe a honeypot, someone who was leading LBJ and someone that LBJ wanted to impress. And she helps as part of a coordinator for this as well. Didn't know about that. And again, it's not a crucial bit of knowledge. People can't point to that and say, oh, well, Stephen, that's very thin. That's fine. You can remove Madeleine Krim and all of the rest of this still makes sense. But when you add her, it makes even more sense. This story of Amon Tavni, one of the people who was involved in the attack that day, and he was in a U.S. jail for embezzlement. And he was trying to speak to a former U.S. congressman to get better conditions. And he said, I'd like to talk about what actually happened. Through a series of incidents, he is never heard from again, probably released, deported to Israel, and then probably executed for speaking out of turn. We also have this deep sense of betrayal and deep sense of pain, which was difficult to watch a lot of the time. I will say I didn't see in previous documentaries. I'd read about it in the books, but watching the men talk about it, watching them get choked up, we're talking 50, 60 years later. They're talking about nightmares. They're talking about imagining going back to those memories. Keep in mind when the Liberty had gotten to Malta, the bodies from where the torpedo had hit had been sitting in seawater for 7 days. So the smell that was down there was something that seared into these, and a lot of them were throwing up regularly, but because there was classified material down there, only people with clearance could go down there to clean that up. And there was a man, his last name starts with a K, but he was putting together the parts of the men on the deck. Can you imagine this? So they're down there picking up arms, legs, tibias, fibias, whatever it might be, and he's up there and he's trying to match this to be a body. And I can't imagine what that would be like. And he talked about it that he asked the doctor, why can't I recall the smell that everyone talks about? And the doctor had said, perhaps your brain thought it was such a difficult experience that it just turned it off for you, that you don't remember it. There were 7, I think, sailors who they couldn't find parts. Maybe they only found one part, or they weren't able to identify for sure. So they put them all into one box and they buried them in Arlington. And the original tombstone said died in the Eastern Mediterranean. Like they caught a cold. And it took years, and I think probably the good work of the Veterans Association for the USS Liberty to get it changed to killed on USS Liberty. But they didn't even want the tombstone to offend the Israelis. And here, this goes back to the meta narrative of the Israelis are beyond criticism. They have never done anything wrong in the history of mankind. Even if they did do something wrong, you can't bring it up ever, because that's anti-Semitic. And if you bring it up, as we saw, and this is for my film clubs for Palestine Bookshelf, so not for this channel, you will be called not one of their people. You will be exiled as a Jew for bringing up any criticism. And this is just unhealthy for an organization, for a race, for a religion. If you are incapable of seeing the mistakes that you've made, you cannot survive as an organization, as an institution, etc. And people think, they say, well, Stephen, Judaism has been around a long time. Well, first of all, no. Mosaic Judaism ended when the temple was destroyed. What came after was Talmudic Judaism, which is younger than Christianity. The Talmud was written later. And then you have Zionism, which is now melded together with Judaism such that people can say anti-Semitic equals anti-Zionist. So it hasn't been around that long. The state of Israel has been around as long as my mother. So it can go. So it just because it's there doesn't mean it can't go away. But the grip that it has on the United States now dates back to 1967. And part of it, I think, is alluded to in this documentary as well. This furnishes definitive blackmail material on the United States by the state of Israel. While the state of Israel may be afraid to admit to what happened, I think it might be more catastrophic for the United States. So for example, let's say it finds out and Israel gets state aid cut off from the US. Okay. But what does that mean for the United States? If this were ever to get to a point where enough Americans would find out and actually be upset about something. When it comes to foreign affairs, public policy, policy is not driven by public opinion in foreign affairs, generally speaking. There can be some pressures, but there are other pressures usually that are brought to bear. And foreign policy doesn't play a role in US elections as well. It's just a sideshow. There's always domestic issues that dominate US elections. So when I think about this documentary and I think about the level of betrayal, I think that's probably what this brings home more than anything is what kind of feeling could any of us even try to reach towards to replicate what these men felt. They took an oath to defend the United States, and that country betrayed them. We have the story in here of Admiral Kidd, which is reported in both of the books that I read and in at least one of the documentaries that I've already covered. and he took his stars off his rank, and he said, "Just talk to me like like I'm your dad. Tell me what happened." They told him exactly what happened. He puts his stars back on and says, "Now, if you're ever to repeat this to anybody, you're going to go to Leavenworth or worse." And do you know what "or worse" means? Obviously implying death. This is how these men were treated. They were betrayed by their own government, by something they believed in deeply, something that they were going to spend their life doing. On top of that, they have the memories of their comrades dying, some of them having to assemble their body piece by piece after 7 days after it had happened, and waiting 17 hours for Americans to come rescue them. In the meantime, a Russian ship had stopped by and asked, "Do you need help?" So the Russians were there before the Americans were to offer help. I mean, what would that feel like? And to know that that betrayal has continued on for decades and decades and decades. To this day, the US government and the Navy specifically refuses to move forward on any further investigations of Liberty. So there isn't a congressional investigation. There's no further idea other than this was a case of mistaken identity. And I'll talk about this in my stream that follows this on the Palestine Bookshelf channel. I would have to believe that both the Israeli Air Force and the Navy were incompetent simultaneously to believe this was a mistake. I would have to believe that the 9, 10, 11 dozen overflights that happened in the morning in which the Americans were waving to the Israeli pilots were all false. So we have overflights. They knew it was an American ship. The Americans knew they were Israeli flights. And then we have these jets, unmarked jets. They were painted that way. And then we have Israeli torpedo boats, all again repeating lies that, which I'll talk about in the 2002 documentary stream, which is next. So I don't want to get the documentaries crossed, but just to continue with the timeline, I do not believe that the Israelis didn't know who this ship was. And this documentary has a wonderful graphic showing the two ships by side. The one that the Israelis claimed they mistook it for, the Al-Qasir, an Egyptian horse carrier, and the Liberty. And there's no comparison between a modern American intelligence gathering ship with a bunch of antennas and a US flag and this thing that's much smaller and doesn't have any kind of that marking and would have Arabic script on the hull, not lettering as we would know it from GTR 5, which is what would have been on the Liberty's hull. In any case, it's 4 hours well invested, and I would say it will shortcut you. You won't have to have done what I did, which was watch 2 books, read 2 books, and watch 3 documentaries. If you just watch this documentary, you are going to have a very healthy understanding of the timeline of what happened with Liberty, the players involved, and the larger questions around it. So I can't recommend it enough. It's also got an original soundtrack. It's got a lot of survivors talking there. Just tremendous work. I got to find out if I can give a contribution to this director who did it. A tremendous tribute to the men of the Liberty and their memory, and I'm so edified by the work he did. So I will be quiet here for a moment. I think I've covered everything I wanted to talk about in my notes. Yeah, mostly I have. Really appreciate Commander Lewis. He dominates this. He was the head. Remember that the Liberty is divided into 2 sections. You have the crew that are running the ship. Then you have the crew that are manning the intelligence gathering, which is happening in separate sections. And Commander Lewis was in charge of those men. And he just presents, you can just tell by the way he talks, what a leader, what a strong individual. Again, very edified by his testimony as well. So if there are any questions, I will do my best to answer them or try to point you towards resources that will have answers. Otherwise, as usual, if there aren't any more questions, I'll wrap up the stream and I'll head over to the Palestine Bookshelf stream, which will wrap up my mini series on the Liberty, which we've spent, as I said, the last 3 weeks covering a couple books. And at this point will be 3 documentaries altogether. And I credit Candace Owens. I know other people had brought it up, and I'm not trying to take away any credit from them. If other people had been bringing up the Liberty sooner, I had bought the 2 books that I'd bought last year. I knew I was going to cover the Liberty at some time in 2025, but Candace interviewing one of the survivors who is quite prominent in this documentary as well, led me to push that timeline up. So I moved those two books up to now, and that's why I read them recently. But they're an important part of understanding as well 1967, which I'll be talking about, I want to say, in about a month on Palestine Bookshelf, which is a really crucial event because it gets us to where we are in the present. 1948 was the beginning. 1967 was, let's say, the finishing of 1948. All right. Any other questions or comments? It's been quiet as far as questions or comments this stream. All right. Well, thank you all for coming on, joining. I really encourage you to watch the documentary. It's a fantastic piece of work. And as I say, as a shortcut, if you can say 4.5 hours is a shortcut to really understanding what happened with the USS Liberty and why it happened and why it's important that people know about it. If you'd like to hear even more about this, as I said, I'll be over on the Palestine Bookshelf channel in about 8-9 minutes, and I'm going to start a stream there on a BBC documentary from 2002, which, as I said, some footage that appears in this documentary was excerpted from that documentary, so it's preserved some really important information for the record, which was already used in this documentary. All right, thanks everybody for joining, and hopefully if you want to learn more, I'll see you over on that stream.